Okay, great. Just before I get started, I want to ask you a question. How many people know about the Days of Action in Ontario? Okay, that's pretty good. How many people here participated in the Days of Action? Okay, that's an age test. It's like Logan's Run. You guys have to leave now. Okay, so I won't just make up some crazy lies about things. I'm gonna outline a bit of a timeline of events around the Days of Action, and then Jenny is going to give the analysis and talk about why the Days of Action are relevant. So I'll just get right to it, and there's a lot of ground to cover. So apologies. Okay. The election of Mike Harris in 1995 heralded a major assault on the welfare state under the auspices of his common sense revolution. This ruling class attack did not go unanswered. From 1995 to 1998, the labor movement in Ontario organized 11 one-day citywide strikes and protests across the province. The Days of Action offered a bold extra-parliamentary a response to Harris's right-wing agenda that had the possibility of defeating the common sense revolution. However, a number of weaknesses served to undermine the potential of the movement and steer it towards demobilization and ultimately defeat. Harris was elected in '95 with a large majority, running on a promise of major tax cuts, spending cuts, deregulation, and privatization. This common sense revolution was a hard economic right platform, akin with Reagan and Thatcher, and unlike the previous Tory dynasty that ruled Ontario from 1943 to 1985. He defeated Bob Rae, and Bob Rae's Ontario NDP actually had won an unexpected majority government in 1990. But staring down a massive recession in 1991 and faced with strident resistance from big business and no corresponding external pressure from the left or unions, the NDP abandoned core policies like the public auto insurance. It quickly curtailed promised spending on social programs. It handed out massive subsidies to businesses, and by the end of its term, instituted something called the social contract, a massive austerity attack on public sector workers. This left the Ontario labor movement divided. At the 1993 Ontario Federation of Labor's convention, a split occurred inside the labor movement over the question of disaffiliating from the NDP. What we'll call common front unions, that was all the public sector unions like CUPE and OPSU, sided with the Canadian auto workers and supported this disaffiliation. This ultimately passed, but they were opposed by pink paper unions. Ask me why they're called pink paper unions as a question. I'm not going to get into it. Mostly, these were private sector unions, like the steel workers, like Amalgamated Transit Union, UFCW, SEIU, etc. They supported the NDP and opposed this and actually walked out of the convention. This split in labor was to be a key weakness in the fight against Harris. The first targets of Mike Harris's common sense revolution were the most marginalized in society. A 21% cut to social assistance was announced almost immediately. Cuts to Wheel-Trans, cuts to subsidies for childcare, cuts to housing, cuts to public transportation, and the downloading of a host of social services to municipalities. The cuts were to be swift, and they were to be painful. A loose network of feminists, queer activists, anti-poverty activists, childcare workers, and rank-and-file trade unionists who had learned lessons from the protest movement against Ralph Klein's conservative government in Alberta, were the first to move into action. Against the advice and wishes of some labor leaders and other parts of the left, Naomi Klein, and they formed an ad hoc mobilization group called Embarrass Harris. They helped to organize a protest in June at Harris's swearing in, and they were central to numerous protests and actions, big and small, across the province throughout the fall. In July of 1995, responding to pay equity cuts and potential massive cuts to social spending, CUPE childcare workers in Toronto organized a one-day illegal strike. This not only shut down the 17 childcare centers organized by CUPE, but it shut down 85 centers across the GTA, as many non-union workers also joined the strike action. Protests against cuts to Wheel-Trans and social assistance continued through the summer. The embarrassed Harris activists began to make inroads in labor. Rank-and-file OPSU members circulated a petition for a Work to Rule campaign against Harris's planned cuts of 13,000 jobs to Ontario Public Service, and to endorse the September 27th action, the day the legislature was set to open. The Embarrass Harris campaign and activists put forward a motion at Toronto Labour Council to support that day of action, and were present at leafleting at Labor Day rallies across the province, which were all much, much bigger than they had been in a decade. The murder of Dudley George by the OPP in Ipperwash in early September brought home the cruel, violent, and racist nature of the Harris government and fed into the urgency of the moment. Thousands turned out on September 27th in the protest in Toronto, with buses coming from as far away as Sudbury, and local actions happened elsewhere. These Embarrass Harris actions through the summer helped build the confidence of wider layers to take action. Throughout the fall, protests dogged the Tory MPPs across the province. In response to even further cuts to childcare, 5,000 childcare spaces, where 5,000 childcare spaces could be lost in Metro Toronto, another childcare strike was organized in November 13th in Toronto, with even wider participation. And on November 24th of that year, a provincial childcare strike was organized, with 11,000 childcare workers walking off the job, closing somewhere between 800 and 1,200 childcare centers in the province. The Embarrass Harris actions helped pave the way for a more formal union participation in the extra parliamentary resistance to the Common Sense Revolution. In October, the Tories introduced the Anti-Union Bill 7 and Anti-Pay Equity Bill 8. Now, ask me about how brutal those were. They basically took away card check certification, first successor rights, they banned picket lines on private property, they took away anti-scab legislation, and a whole host of other things. This was a massive assault that had, this naked assault on workers' rights actually really shook labor. And this, coupled with the burgeoning anti-Harris protest movement, and the agitation of rank-and-file activists inside unions, pushed labor leaders to finally take action in a more bold way. The CAW talked publicly about organizing an illegal strike in the fall. And Gord Wilson, who was president of the OFL at the time, sent a letter asking affiliates if we could organize a one-day general strike on November 1st. Pink paper union leaders were quick to shoot down this idea, and ultimately even the CAW walked this back, despite prominent support from important CAW locals, especially in Otto. While the idea of an immediate general strike was called off, there was an agreement by early November to launch a one-day citywide strike before Christmas. London, Ontario was picked as the target. The OFL convention was then slated to happen in later November. And this convention actually reflected a very deep division inside the labor union. Pink Paper Union successfully put forward a motion to reestablish support for the NDP, while Common Front unions were able to pass a fight-back motion, which set in motion the Days of Action strategy. This outlined a series of one-day strikes that would ultimately culminate in a province-wide shutdown and general strike. However, prominent backers of the Days of Action strategy were defeated in their bids for re-election at the OFL, on the OFL executive. So this meant that the OFL executive had adopted a strategy of the Days of Action, but the people who were most sort of central to pushing that forward are actually defeated on the executive. So it left the OFL with a strategy without necessarily its core backers at the helm. So let's get into some of these Days of Action. The first one in London was on December 11th. And I'm going to give you a bit of a flavor. It's a very quick timeline. Matter of weeks they had to organize this. Bargaining units at the CAW locals were balloted for strikes. CUPE and OPSU locals committed to walking off the job. Same with postal workers and other federal public sector workers. Despite their unions not supporting the day of action, ATU members in London decided to strike, shutting down London Transit. 1,000 UFCW members who were part of the Cuddy Foods plant also went on strike against the explicit wishes of their union. 130,000 flyers were delivered across London to homes talking about the day of action. High school students organized a massive walkout that day. The day saw numerous auto and manufacturing plants close with active pickets. Transit was shut down, except for vehicles permitted by the strike. Construction sites were empty, municipal services were shuttered, the college and university were disrupted. A mass rally was held downtown with about 14,000 in attendance. The day of action was a success. London saw massive economic disruption, and on short notice, organizers had won arguments inside unions and workplaces to engage in a legal job action. And new layers of community members and trade unionists who had been pulled into activity, and most importantly, the confidence of the class had been boosted to take on Harris. Despite these successes, there were some notable weaknesses. The 5 teachers' unions, who were not part of the OFL, did not participate at all. The pink paper unions were largely absent and non-supportive. And debates about the next steps and strategy of the movement had entirely been monopolized by the labor leadership and not the rank and file. Oh, wow, okay. 5 minutes left. I'm going to go over time, folks. Sorry. The next day of action was in Hamilton on February 23rd. And this took place in relationship to a potential job cuts and strike action by OPSU to stop the 13,000 jobs being cut. And also, more importantly, Bill 26 was introduced, and it was an omnibus bill that basically brought in about $1.5 billion worth of cuts to healthcare, to education, to transit, to municipal transfers. These were sweeping cuts were announced, and this actually acted as a catalyst for the movement. The Hamilton Day of Action, they created a model that subsequent days of actions followed. They elected a co-chair, a community member, Andrea Horvath, and a labor member to lead the organizing efforts. Unions provided the money for offices and phones and printing, and unlike in London, teachers were now on the move because they were facing cuts. On the day of the strike, postal operations were shut down, transit was shut down, 14 large manufacturing plants were shut down, and there was 25,000 people on the Friday of the strike out rallying. The following day, there was a rally that got somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 out in the streets of Hamilton. By any measure, the Hamilton Day of Action was a massive success. Huge numbers took part in job actions, and even bigger numbers were involved in the protests. But there was a clear missed opportunity. The strike by OPSU around the OPS cuts started on the Monday following the strike. And there was no real connection between that strike and the days of action. Labor leaders had no plan to connect the day of action, and OPSU itself had no understanding or willingness to leverage the days of action to support their strike. And this strike, by the way, involved 50,000 workers right across the province. There was a clear, I think, willingness of participants of the days of action at this point to call for an escalation. Chants that became very popular, both in the OPSU strike, which lasted a month, and ultimately was defeated and was super violent. The strikes that were popular were, hey Mike, how do you like a general strike? And city by city is way too slow. Let's shut down Ontario. The next two actions were a step back for the movement. In Kitchener and in Peterborough of April and June, these actions, while big in relationship to the size of the cities, were obviously a step back because there was no coordination or connection between those strikes. They were successive. They weren't trying to build towards anything. And the following strike, the big Metro Days of Action here in Ontario, was called 4 months away. I'm just going to breeze through the next little bit here. But essentially, the Metro Days of Action was called in October, and it resulted in a massive strike. So the Day of Action took place on the Friday, and the rally took place on the Saturday. Something like all the garbage collection was stopped, the libraries were closed, the LCBO was closed, 12% of students showed up, there were student walkouts, teachers were participating, the whole TTC was closed, most of the manufacturing plants in Toronto were closed, and it was described as a ghost town. And the following day, the rally got somewhere between, conservatively, 130,000 to 250,000 people out in the streets. This was an incredible show of force, and it had sort of infused momentum into the movement that had sort of lagged with the Days of Action that had been much smaller in Kitchener, Waterloo, and elsewhere. However, while the Days of Action had sort of built, I think, a very impressive moment, almost immediately, the pink paper unions, like within a week, actually held a public press conference denouncing the Days of Action strategy. And they said the union should be supporting the NDP, and we don't support this extra parliamentary activity. And this actually sapped the movement of its momentum, and the subsequent Days of Action that were called in places like Thunder Bay and Windsor and North Bay seemed far away. And the Thunder Bay action actually was quite small. So I'm going to just skip ahead and the Sudbury action and the Thunder Bay action. I'm just going to skip ahead because I'm running way over time. Is that there's another inflection point in this movement. In the summer and fall of 1997, the Tories infused the movement with more urgency as they introduced two bills, Bill 136 and Bill 160. Both of these bills were an attack on collective agreements of public sector workers. One was on generally all public sector workers and municipalities, and one was on teachers. And this provoked especially a strike amongst teachers. And so the teachers, by November of 1997, went out on strike right across the province. And at that time, we had 5 teachers' unions. And that basically, that strike, in some ways, re-energized the movement, but also within days of that strike being called and workers were out on the lines, union by union, the teachers' unions started to cave. They thought they couldn't actually defeat the bill, and that sort of set the groundwork for the OFL convention in 1997, which basically packed it in for the Days of Action. They passed a motion supporting a general strike, but there was no date called, and there was 2 subsequent Days of Actions, but they basically did not involve workplace activity. So I'll just finish off. While the Days of Action is in some ways failed, it showed the possibility that an extra parliamentary opposition movement could take on and defeat the big business agenda. At various moments, the movement could have been ramped up to cause a political crisis to force the Tories to back down. And there was inflection points. The 1995 fall strike, call for a general strike in 1995, the Hamilton Days of Actions, linking up with a potential OPSU strike within days that wasn't taken, and the moment after the Metro Days of Action, and finally around the teacher strike, where there could have been Days of Action and coordinated strikes called in support of the teachers, but weren't. Now, Jenny's going to discuss the lessons and relevancy of the Days of Action.
Thank you, Dave, for laying, can everyone hear me? Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dave, for laying out the history of the Days of Actions. As we reflect on the lessons from that period, it's crucial to recognize what they mean for us today and how we can apply them to our current struggles. The Days of Actions weren't just about protests. They were about building the working class and creating a unified movement. They demonstrated the immense power that workers can wield when they come together in solidarity. During that time, Mike Harris's government was dismantling public services, gutting rent controls, and attacking labor rights. But the response from the people through coordinated general strikes and mass mobilization showed the power the workers have to shut down entire cities across Ontario. I'll be focusing on 3 key lessons from the Days of Action: the ability to build alliance between labor and community organizations, the power of building an independent rank-and-file network, and the need for sustained and persistent mobilization. The Days of Action's ability to build coalitions between labor unions and community groups was a key factor in the movement's strength, as it allowed for a broad-based resistance to Mike Harris's government policies. As Dave mentioned, Harris' common sense revolution began by attacking the most marginalized, starting with the brutal 21% cut to social assistance. It's no surprise that the communities most affected were the ones to take action first, even before labor leadership was fully on board. This is why community organizations is essential to the labor movement, because workers are not separate from the community. They are the community. Workers are the community. Broad coalitions between labor and social movements allowed for a wider scope of activism that went beyond traditional workplace issues. Grassroots organizations that emerged from the dire circumstances they faced helped build the confidence of unions to fight back for their members. These attacks weren't just aimed at individuals. They were an attack on the entire working class. Workers were among the hardest hit, struggling with the cuts to housing, transportation, and childcare services they relied on for themselves and their families. These grassroots movements played a critical role in influencing the labor movement, showing how community groups often had the agility to act before formal labor leadership was fully mobilized. The embarrassed Harris actions were successfully shut down, which successfully shut down over 1,000 childcare centers, paved the way for unions to join the fight. These early grassroots victories proved the power of direct action, showing the labor movement that real change was possible. The success of early actions like Embarrass Harris campaign inspired unions to adopt more militant and confrontational tactics, which eventually led to mass mobilization seen in the Days of Action. Organizing communities will build the confidence of workers to hold their union leadership accountable. All workers come from communities, and rank-and-file workers are often among the most vulnerable. Community grassroots organizing was crucial in pushing unions to act, and in many cases, they were the ones driving the resistance. We can't simply wait for the labor movement to act on our behalf. Our communities and grassroots networks must continue to push for a government that works for us and also continue to organize outside of the electoral system. This involves power structures in our communities, building power structures in our communities, creating a structure that serves the needs of our class without the reliance on the state and union leadership is essential to hold our government bodies and union leadership accountable. Organizing outside of state-recognized or traditional union structures will also allow for a more radical approach, such as strikes, walkouts, and other forms of direct actions, which often limits what union leadership can do. The next key success to the Days of Action was building the rank and file. One of the key successes of the Days of Actions was educational campaigns that accompanied the protests. Unions and community organizations worked tirelessly to educate their members and the broader public about the consequences of Harris' government policies. This was essential in changing public opinion, particularly among those who had initially supported Harris, swayed by promises to tax cuts and economic reform. The success of the movement was largely due to the ability to shift the narrative, reframing Harris's austerity measures not as fiscal responsibility, but as an attack on working people and vulnerable populations. Unions used workplace meetings, leaflets, and public forums to break down the complexities of these policies, explaining how cuts to social assistance healthcare, and public services directly harmed workers and their families. This grassroots education helped build the solidarity among workers who may have previously viewed the government's actions as beneficial. By focusing on the real-life impacts, rising housing costs, reduced access to public services, and stagnant wages, the campaign highlighted the broader class struggle beyond just labor rights, connecting it to the fight for basic dignity in everyday life. Building the rank and file isn't just about mobilization. It's also about holding union leadership accountable. Too often, union leadership becomes disconnected from the everyday struggles of workers they're supposed to represent. By strengthening the rank and file, power is put back in the hands of the workers themselves, not just a few in leadership. When workers are educated, organized, and empowered, they can ensure that leadership reflects their interests and that decisions are made with their needs in mind. This creates a more democratic and responsive labor movement, one that is driven by a collective will of its members rather than a top-down structure. Today, we are seeing a rising support for unions, but this support needs to translate into real actions. Political education remains a key tool in organizing across sectors and industries, bringing together public and private sectors, union, non-unionized workers, and community groups. Pink paper unions and public sector unions may have different immediate priorities, but the rank and file workers in both sectors face the same core issues: stagnant wages, unaffordable housing, and lack of public services. The Days of Action demonstrate the importance of bridging divides between these groups, uniting them around the shared struggle, which starts with educating workers about the collective nature of their challenges. The general strikes during the Days of Action showcase the power of collective labor action. When workers are armed with a deep understanding of how government policies are affecting their lives, walked off the job, and entire cities were shut down, it forced the government to take notice. The mass mobilizations were made possible because of the internal educational efforts that shifted public opinion and built a unified response to austerity. This level of mass mobilization is what we need to consider again today. Small protests or symbolic victories won't be enough. Coordinated labor actions, including general strikes, are necessary tools in the fight against austerity and neoliberalism. Finally, we must recognize that the fight against Ford and Poilievre's division tactics is more than just resisting their individual policies. It's about fighting against a system that seeks to divide and weaken us. Whether it's public versus private sector workers, unionized versus non-unionized labor, or working class people pitted against each other over housing, these are tactics designed to fragment our movement. We win by standing together. We need to organize from the ground up, engage the rank and file, and unite across sectors to fight for housing, wages, and public services. This is how we resist. This is how we win. The next lesson we can learn from the Days of Action is the need for sustained and persistent mobilization. While the Days of Action mobilized hundreds of thousands of workers and community members across Ontario, one of the key criticisms is that it ultimately failed to bring down the Harris government. Even when initially at the height of the Days of Actions, the Tories lost significant support while the NDP gained support and was winning in the polls. This failure can largely be attributed to the lack of continuity and internal divisions within the labor movement, which prevented the actions from escalating into a sustained province-wide movement that could have mounted a stronger challenge to the Harris agenda. The Days of Actions had the potential to grow into something far larger. At its peak, the movement had shut down entire cities and industries, showing the government that mass mobilization could paralyze the economy and generate significant public support. However, the actions were confined to one-day events in specific cities, and a province-wide general strike, something that could have posed a more direct threat to the government, was never called, despite the fact that the OFL resolution was passed in full support. This lack of follow-through represents a major missed opportunity and also brought more distrust amongst members with the labor leadership. With the strong rank-and-file network built, there were workers petitioning and applying pressure to call for a general strike date. The movement's momentum died off without continuous pressure on the government, which also led to the loss of support for the NDP and the Days of Action. One of the key lessons for this was the internal divisions within the labor movements, particularly between the private and public sector unions. These divisions undermined the ability of the movement to act cohesively on a provincial level. While more militant unions like the Canadian Auto Workers were prepared to take bolder actions, others were more hesitant. For example, some industrial unions, which had initially issued the pink paper supporting the new Democratic Party, were reluctant to fully endorse the more confrontational tactics proposed by the public sector unions and militant labor leaders. These strategic disagreements within the movement made it difficult to build the unified front necessary for a sustained escalation of the days of action. The movement's lack of sustained activism meant that it was largely reactive rather than proactive. While the one-day strikes raised awareness and put pressure on the government, they were not followed up with continuous mass mobilization needed to maintain momentum. Without a province-wide general strike or continuous action, the movement eventually lost its ability to pressure the government effectively. The Harris government was able to continue implementing its policies largely because the labor movement and its allies failed to maintain consistent and escalating pressure. The legacy of Days of Actions, however, remains significant. It showed the power of mass mobilization, coalition building between labor and community groups, and the potential of grassroots activism to challenge government policies. The movement also helped to build a new generation of activists and strengthen networks of solidarity that continue to fight for social and economic justice today. Yet it serves as a critical reminder that without sustained action, internal unity and the willingness to escalate beyond symbolic one-day protests, movements risk losing the very battles they are fighting for. Next, I'm just going to speak about a more recent example of the province being on the brink of a general strike was when the education workers led an illegal strike. 55,000 education workers led an illegal strike in 2022. Just for a quick overview on what happened, for those of you that weren't aware, in 2022, Doug Ford's government passed Bill 28, stripping 55,000 education workers of their rights to strike and collective bargaining. This bill criminalized strike actions and invoked the notwithstanding clause to override constitutional rights. Ford claimed the bill was about keeping students in class, but the reality was a direct attack on workers. Education workers led by CUPE's OSBCU and their president Laura Walton had prepared for this confrontation for almost a year, building the political consciousness and having education workers prepared to go on strike. They secured a 96.5% strike mandate with the 83% turnout. We saw community organizations and parents groups in solidarity shifting public opinion to support education workers on strike. As public support grew with the Paint the Town Purple campaign, with parents, workers, and community showing large support through protests, leaflets, wearing purple t-shirts, there was an immediate backlash and outrage regarding Bill 28 when it was introduced, which led to mass mobilization. On October 31st, the Ontario Federation of Labour launched the Hands Off Workers' Rights campaign, and thousands rallied the next day in Toronto. Again, this shows how quickly Labour can organize a mass campaign and the reach that the Labour movement has. Yes, it was the community that gave Labour the motivation, but we saw how Labour can work with the community to quickly mobilize. OPSU, Ontario's largest public sector union, encouraged its 8,000 members to join the walkout, and public support for the strike grew rapidly. As public pressure mounted, the OFL Executive Board voted to escalate to a general strike starting November 14 of 2022, if the bill wasn't repealed. The looming general strike was the largest threat Ford had faced, and the Conservative government has faced since the Days of Action in the 1990s. Under pressure from escalating protests and the threat of a general strike, Ford made a reversal on November 7th, announcing the repeal of Bill 28 and called an emergency press conference. This was a massive victory for education workers and the broader labor movement in Ontario, showing the power of collective action and solidarity. While the bill was repealed, the debate within the labor movement continues on whether maintaining leverage until a fair deal is secured. This victory shows the potential of mass mobilizations, but continued pressure will be needed to ensure workers win. Lessons from the OSBCU strike that are similar to the Days of Action. 1, rank and file activity is essential. The most important lesson from this victory is that rank and file organizing matters more than anything else. Education workers, through months and years of groundwork, laid the foundation for a powerful strike and built a strong base capable of engaging in defiance, including an illegal strike. This kind of organizing creates a culture of democracy, accountability, and transparency, and is critical for ensuring that workers are ready to act even if the leadership is hesitant. The victory showed that leadership alone cannot drive a movement. A confident and organized rank and file is necessary to keep the pressure on, even when leaders might want to back down or take a deal. The next lesson is solidarity must be visible, accessible, and everywhere. Solidarity actions need to be easy for people to join, highly visible, and spread across the province. This kind of broad-based solidarity gives other workers the confidence to act, knowing they have the backing of their peers and communities. Campaigns like Paint the Province Purple allowed anyone, regardless of location or union status, to participate, building momentum and visibility. This kind of solidarity strengthens the movement and also demoralizes the opponents. We don't have to wait for elections to fight back. Ford's defeat came just 5 months after his re-election, proving that we don't need to wait for an election to take on a government and win. By organizing and mobilizing between elections, labor and community movements can change the political landscape. The rapid escalation shows that organized labor can impose real defeats on government without waiting for the next electoral cycle and can shift the debate long before the next vote. Workers are ready to act when given the chance. The strike showed that when workers have an outlet for their anger, they will take action. After an election, the record low voter turnout, it was clear that workers had lost faith in the system, but their frustration hadn't disappeared. These lessons emphasize the labor movement must build from the ground up, focusing on rank and file based building to ensure that organizing can continue even if leadership is hesitant or takes deals workers do not want. Community solidarity must be visible and widespread to strengthen worker confidence. Finally, mobilizing between elections and recognizing the potential for rapid escalation are key to sustaining long-term victories. Workers are ready to act, and it's up to us to continue organizing and giving them the opportunities to do so.